Hello, I'm Chris Kruger, Senior Content Manager for the Davis Phinney Foundation, and I'm here with Dr. Alberto Espay for a bonus round following our webinar earlier in August 2024 when we were talking about Parkinson's subtypes. There were a lot of questions that we had from the audience that we didn't get to, and we just thought it would be really a great opportunity to talk again and get to as many of those questions as we could. So, we're just going to jump right into that. But I will say this, you can look at the description in this video and you'll be able to see a link back to that original conversation. The first question we had was about symptom-based subtyping. This is perhaps postural instability, gait disturbance, or tremor predominance, or bradykinesia predominance. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that topic, or those topics really. Are these subtypes in a significant way? Does treatment plan change if you are tremor predominant versus bradykinesia predominant? Does prognosis change? Is there a way you can make a prognosis based on these subtypes? What's the significance of symptom-based subtyping?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Well, there was a time when we looked at people and began to try to classify them according to the dominant expression of their Parkinson's, and the rough classification of tremor dominant versus non-tremor dominant, or postural instability gait disorder, which is a way of saying not tremor, but gait seems to be more dominant, meant to help us see Parkinson's as coming in different flavors, and presumably that would imply different underlying biologies. So many studies were done to try to determine what makes people have a tremor and many others have no tremor. And that if we can identify what is it about tremor biologically, we can then determine what is about not tremor biologically, and in that way have a match between the clinical subtyping and the biological subtyping, which is the one that matters the most. Well, no matter how many studies there have been inspired on this idea, none have matched any others. So essentially, we got a large literature of clinical subtypes that, if you put those criteria together about what each of these clinical subtypes mean and then try to replicate it in a different cohort, you won't get the same results. Nor you will get the same curves as it relates to what happened to people with tremor versus people without tremor long-term. Traditionally, it's been said that if you have a tremor, you may have an overall better response to treatment, slower progression to milestones, and that if you don't have tremor, that's not quite the same. It's the opposite. But we see many examples of the exact opposite. So the clinical symptoms are very imperfect expressions of what the underlying biology is. And I think the time has come where many of us, perhaps not most of us yet, realize that this idea of classifying people specifically according to the symptoms because of the clinical subtypes that we could then learn from isn't going to translate into meaningful information about what the underlying biology of those individuals is, nor what type of responses they may have to different therapies, symptomatic or otherwise, disease modification therapies, nor what's in the future for them. And when I, early in my career, I was sort of applying what we at the time felt was the lessons from these studies and tried to then determine what the prognosis was for people, I was always wrong. And that was something that I think I mentioned in my prior session.
Yeah, a lot of what you've said relates back to the biological subtyping as a topic that's discussed a lot in the first recording we made. And so if you're interested in that, look back at that first video and you'll find more information about that topic of biological subtyping. So don't overlook that detail. It's in that other video. Sorry.
Right. Yeah, no, I'm glad you mentioned it because so biological subtyping is where we need to go because the therapies that we will have to change the disease, not just to help the symptoms, but to alter the disease, to reverse it ideally, require matching the therapies to people's biology. So clinical subtyping alone doesn't allow us to do that.
Okay, great. So thanks for that insight. And I guess I would ask one, or I would speculate maybe. Tell me if there's if this is a valid supposition. One's symptoms are quite likely to change over time, right? So that's part of the issue here, right? I might be tremor predominant today. I may have a really pronounced tremor, and then tomorrow I may have less of a tremor, and that may trend that direction. I could become more bradykinesia, could be a more difficult symptom. So it's sort of that can happen to people. Is that true?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, it's been demonstrated with PPMI data that the so-called instability of the clinical phenotype, which is to say how much a clinical subtype changes is quite high. Within a year, is as high as 40%. People can switch from one category to another, which invalidates really the whole idea of putting people into categories based on the clinical expression.
Another question we received was about symptom severity subtypes. Diffuse malignant, I think, is a term some people may have read in some studies, or mild or moderate. So can you talk about those? Do those change in the same way? Are they meaningful in a different way? Just give us a little insight into that if you can.
So that particular classification, mild, moderate, diffuse malignant, is what's been referred to as a data-driven subtyping. And by that, essentially, you got an algorithm that is applied to a cohort. The algorithm sees a spectrum from people who have very mild expression of Parkinson's, people who have very severe, and decides based on certain rules what groups are there. And so the groups that this algorithm churns out are those three: mild, moderate, severe, called diffuse malignant. I don't see a whole bunch of value to it. The only supporting rationale for that is that if people aren't doing very well from the beginning, that tends to predict not doing very well beyond that. And unfortunately, people who seem to have a rather aggressive expression of disease will continue having an expression of the disease no matter what we do sometimes. People who have a milder expression of disease will also behave very predictably in a mild one. So when you have this classification, is simply to say, well, here, if we divide people mild, moderate, severe from the beginning, and then looked again at mild, moderate, severe at a later time point, we find that we cannot get the same people. Well, that's because there is a rough predictability of the slope of change over time within each of these data-driven subtypes. That's all. Yes, the trajectory would be similar, would be a steeper slope of decline for the most severe kind, the diffuse malignant, and a milder slope of decline for the mild. Doesn't matter in terms of what biology we're talking about. We don't know. Pathology is exactly the same. It's been demonstrated that it's exactly the same.
So it sounds like this is a somewhat insignificant subtype for the person with Parkinson's. This is more maybe a research-oriented subtype that might have been thought to have an interest potentially.
Absolutely. This has no value for an individual with Parkinson's. It doesn't tell him or her anything meaningful about it, and it is only a tool.
So it's important to maybe note that if you're reading a research article and you see this sort of conversation about this subtyping class, it may be important to just pump the brakes on assuming that the results of this are going to be meaningful to you, based on whether you believe yourself to have a moderate course of Parkinson's, or your symptoms are moderate, or if you think they're severe. It may not be relevant to draw any conclusions for your own life from that. Is that your assessment?
Very, very important. Absolutely true.
Great. So how about young onset Parkinson's? Is that a subtype? Can you talk a little, I mean, this is a big topic, I recognize, but is that a valid way to think about differentiating between people with Parkinson's as a subtyping system?
In general, age seems to be important in as much as the earlier the age at onset, the more benign the overall Parkinson's appears to be, the more likely it is that the basis for it are dominantly genetic over environmental, and therefore that there may be a greater influence of a gene as opposed to many different genes and many different environmental exposures. So it offers some practical purpose in terms of trying to classify people into whether there will be a heavier genetic influence versus a non-specific combination of both genetic susceptibilities and environmental exposures, which is sort of what the party line has been about, what Parkinson's, where Parkinson's comes from.
So I think I understand you to have just said that young onset Parkinson's, people with younger onset of Parkinson's, just to say it more broadly, tend to have a more likely, they're more likely to have a genetic trigger or a cause of their Parkinson's.
Correct.
And that seems to be a very clear example of maybe one way to think about a biological background. And so there are treatments in clinical trial right now that are looking at specific gene variants. Is that true? Is that one reason this is a useful subtype?
Yes, it is true. Now, I think that unfortunately we jump to the conclusion quite readily that if you have a genetic expression of Parkinson's, if we know what that gene is, that we can do a therapy against the gene or to correct the gene. Well, it turns out that any given gene is actually a Pandora box of many different biological changes, and it depends on the specific mutation within the gene what the biology might be. So the problem is that most of the trials, and if not all of the trials at the moment that I'm aware of, that are enrolling patients with either LRRK2 or GBA, the more common genes that we know of at the moment, they're not discriminating between the different genetic mutations. They are including them all within the trial. And so what we have is an intervention that makes sense for what is known about the gene in a global fashion, but it doesn't discriminate between the different individuals that have the genetic mutation. And let me tell you, for instance, LRRK2 is the most common cause of monogenic Parkinson's. Monogenic means it's that one gene. If you have that gene, you can have Parkinson's. But it is so pleomorphic, meaning it's so diverse. It presents actually with ways in which we don't even call them Parkinson's. Progressive supranuclear palsy, frontotemporal dementia. On the brain's autopsy, we examine people who've had those conditions. What we see may not even be Lewy bodies. Sometimes we see other things. So it's clearly very, very heterogeneous. Well, across them all, there is a common increase in kinase activity. That's the biology that's common across everyone. So what's the therapy we're doing for everybody with LRRK2 genes? Kinase inhibitors. We're inhibiting this particular enzyme because we think that that must be the problem with everyone. I have recently come to think that this is probably the compensatory strategy that is operating in people with this mutation. And that once you have a mutation, you have a loss in the function of that gene. What is normally capable of doing cannot be done, and that the compensation for what it would have otherwise done is kinase activity enhancement. In general, in a process of loss, in any process where you have degeneration, whatever goes up tends to be protective, largely because it's reactive against some kind of an injury. So my concern with the current landscape as it relates to biological targeting is that we're treating genes as if they produce a homogeneous biology, and everyone targeted then must have the same kind of problem. I would argue that the one thing that's common across them all is probably not what's causing the problem, but what's been developed as a reaction to the problem.
Okay, so I think I understand you to say that in LRRK2, for example, the kinase activity is elevated, and the treatment approach is to decrease that kinase activity. And that may not work for everybody based on the particular nuances of the way their genetic variant is present in themselves.
I go one step further. I worry that we're going to see what we sometimes see in other fields where we are applying this therapy, people worsen because you're actually targeting something that is nothing, has nothing to do with the cause, but much to do with the reaction against the cause. And we're going to try to explain that this is an issue of dosage, that this is an issue of perhaps measurements, that this is an issue of trial design, that this is an issue of giving the treatment too late. We're going to explain it on the basis of what those trials have done, but not about the idea being wrong.
Okay, so I think this is pointing back to what you said in the previous video that we recorded, where you said if you're thinking about a clinical trial and you're thinking you might have you'd have a genetic mutation or variant, and you're thinking about a trial for LRRK2 or GBA, that's a very important moment for you to say, why am I the right person for this trial, which was your advice in the last session. Exactly. So just because someone has this mutation and just because there's a targeted therapy in research doesn't necessarily mean from your perspective that person is the right person for a specific trial.
You got it.
Okay. So it's important probably to go very deep in, if you get a genetic test, to get to understand as much as you can about this, what it means and what the variant looks like. So genetic counseling may be particularly useful for people so they get a chance to gain as much information as they can have.
Exactly.
And we do have some content about genetic counseling and genetic testing, so we'll put a link to that in the description for this video as well. So we're coming up on the end of the time we had allocated for this, but I have two other quick questions. Okay, they're not going to be quick. I'm sorry about that. That's presumptuous of me. So I would say we got a question about somebody had when they were going through the diagnosis process, an MRI was ordered. And then they heard about the DAT scan after the MRI, and they thought, why was an MRI ordered for me before a DAT scan? And what tests could help to determine if someone does have a particular subtype? I think the answer is right now, maybe there's not much of a test to determine, but what do you think?
Absolutely. There is not a test that determines what subtype anybody is. If we're talking about the subtype that matters, which is the biological subtype, and we don't have yet a test to do that. That's the purpose of our biomarker program, the Cincinnati cohort biomarker program, which, as I've explained, is meant to try to get to the individualized driver. But we right now don't know. We have a very agnostic approach to trying to find out what would Mary's Parkinson's be driven by biological that is entirely irrelevant and will have no bearings in Jim's Parkinson's, but what is about Jim's Parkinson's that make it in that way. So at the moment, we don't have a battery of tests. Now, what we've created, the platform that we have, is a platform that's already used in other fields of medicine.
You're talking about at the Cincinnati cohort.
Exactly. So for now, it's research, but I cannot imagine this not becoming the standard of care, because the way to look at the problem of Parkinson's is to immediately admit, once we make a diagnosis to anyone, to say, we call this Parkinson's, but we have no idea what it means to you. We would have to do a variety of different tests to be able to identify what is your actual disease. For now, let's call it Parkinson's because we don't have any better name for it. But you're blazing your own trail. People are blazing their own trails.
So the reason, I guess the short answer to the question about the MRI part of this is that the MRI could distinguish and say, well, the cause of your Parkinson's symptoms is actually a physical manifestation of some abnormality in the structures in your brain. And that's not Parkinson's, it's something else. And so that's why somebody ordered the MRI, in all likelihood, in this person's case, was to rule out idiopathic Parkinson's. Is that
right?
Likely in your opinion?
So if somebody has meets criteria of Parkinson's, the MRI is normal, essentially. It doesn't show anything. I'm sure that with higher, more resolution MRIs, maybe we'll begin to see subtle changes in the nigra in the midbrain. But at the moment, the standard traditional MRI technology is incapable of showing anything. So I don't order MRIs to people simply because I make the diagnosis. In private practices, unfortunately, very common to get MRIs to people just because it can be done. But I don't typically order them. The DAT scan also doesn't offer much information. If somebody has a clear symptomatology of what we refer to as Parkinson's, then the DAT scan is simply going to confirm that. It's not going to add additional information. There is no particularly tight correlation between how much that signal is decreased and what it means in terms of individuals. Some people have almost no DAT signal. It looks like the worst kind of that scan that you can have, and they're doing perfectly fine. So it's an abnormal DAT. It seems like it should correspond to somebody who is on their last part of life. It can be from people who are actually just doing quite well.
And that is sort of the application for a DAT scan, as I understand it, right? That if somebody's clinical symptoms are not very clear, that's the moment you might order a DAT scan.
Correct.
And that's just to help you understand, okay, yeah, what I'm seeing here is probably related to Parkinson's based on the fact that I'm seeing low level of the image corroborates that diagnosis.
You got it.
Okay, so this is the most complicated question I have for you. You ready for this one?
Sure.
You said in the last recording that there are therapies today that can help change somebody's trajectory. If you understand.
We knew who those individuals are, and that's what we're trying to search for. So yes, I'm convinced that the therapies that we've created over the last 4+ decades aren't junk pieces of chemistry in retrospect. They are marvelous changes, marvelous agents of change, biologically speaking. We just never have known who they were for.
So the question I had, I think you're answering it, is what are those therapies? And I think the answer you just gave is that there are treatments that were in clinical trials and they failed.
Exactly.
But in fact, they only failed because they were applied to the wrong individuals.
Exactly.
And it's a little speculative, but there's reason to think it is accurate based on the conflicting results from one trial to the next. Is that the argument?
You got it. Exactly. I mean, all of these molecules came into trials because what they did in an animal model of Parkinson's was remarkable. We did so well, and so the conclusion was, well, if we were able to dramatically improve this model of Parkinson's, the next step is to give it to people with Parkinson's, as if the mechanism of action of that drug and the response in the animal model was a way to extend the implications to everyone with Parkinson's. And I think that leap of faith has kept on affecting everything we do. And we haven't really taken no for an answer from any of the trials. All the trials have said, no, this is not. And yet we say, well, it's probably the molecule. No, it's not the molecule. Is that we just never knew who that molecule was for because we never kind of came up with the assays to test who has the biology impairment that this molecule is designed to correct.
Yeah, so it's not, in a way, it's not the molecule, it's what the molecule is doing in a given individual because of the way their biology is functioning.
Exactly. And so if there were 2 or 3 people in each of these 200, 300, 500 people trials that benefited, well, those 2 or 3 got drowned in a universe of people that had no business taking that therapy.
Yeah, so the reason I wanted to ask this question is that we had some people that were like, what are those therapies? You know, it's very exciting when you hear somebody say there's something that can really help. And so I just want to make sure we clarified what it is that we're discussing in that context. And there's many pieces of medical treatments that may fall into the category of therapies that can help. It's just we don't know where they belong or where they should go yet. That's the answer.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. And then the corollary to that story is to be very careful when you hear, read, see on TV any story that tells that we have a molecule that's going to be the one that's going to cure Parkinson's. Just be very careful. That will slow the progression in Parkinson's. No, it cannot. If anything will work across everyone, if it's ever shown that anything new will do that, it can only be a symptomatic therapy, cannot be a disease-modifying or neuroprotective intervention.
Well, Dr. Espay, thank you so much for your time again. It's always a delight to speak with you, and I really appreciate you coming back to help us wrap up the topic a little bit, because it was so exciting the first time we talked about subtypes, and there's so many questions, and so we really appreciate you coming back and helping us answer some more of them.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Chris.